All right, hey everyone, welcome. My name is Cristal Cisneros. I am a Latino Outdoors Colorado chapter volunteer, and I am here to introduce Thalía. She is going to be our guest speaker tonight, which we're really excited to just address anti-Blackness in Latinidad. But before we start, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement for the start of this evening. So as we approach the beginning of Latino Conservation Week, the Latino Outdoors Colorado team wants to acknowledge the original peoples of so-called Colorado. We acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Apache nations, and Pueblo and Shoshone tribes. We ask that you acknowledge that no matter where you are celebrating Latino Conservation Week, you are on stolen land. Awesome. So thank you all for that. So I am super privileged and honored to introduce tonight's speaker. I'm going to go ahead and give you some background information. Thalía is an Afro-Indígena healer, by lineage, educator, earthworker, and defender of the people. Born and raised in Colorado, I think I said that right, Thalía, Apache, Ute, Arapaho, Cheyenne territory, identity has been a journey of rediscovery, reclaiming, and decolonizing. As a person of mixed race, Thalía considers herself a bridge between her two communities, Black and Brown, and steps in to address, challenge, and heal lateral violence and conflict between these communities. As a teacher and activist, Thalía is honored and humbled to share knowledge and hold space for others who are challenging colonial structures, perspectives, and systems. Thalía strongly believes that healing and education are equal parts to the liberation of our people and to the overall health harmony of our planet. It is an honor and privilege to be of service. She has stated it's an honor and privilege to be of service to mi gente and to bear witness to the journey of freeing ourselves from the chains of generational and ancestral oppression. So thank you so much, y'all. I'm super excited. I hope you get a lot. Just to give you some background information, Latino Outdoors nationally, we were called in to address the erasure of Afro-Latinos when it comes to our marketing, when it comes to just, trying to push Latinos outdoors. So we here as the Colorado chapter took it as a call in and inviting of where we can really make impact and where we can really acknowledge that Afro-Latinos lives matter, Black lives matter, unequivocally Black lives matter. So without further ado, our speaker, Thalía.
Thank you so much, sis. So I'm going to start really quick with a rezo. This is just how we do things in the indigenous way. So, Sencatlazakamati Wilmiak abuelitos, abuelitas, tatatonati, nanametzli, tonantzintlalek otlikwe. Thank you, abuelitos, abuelitas, grandmothers and grandmothers, or grandfathers for this day, for this moment, for this breath, for yesterday, for tomorrow, for the land, for the water, for the food. Thank you to the original peoples of this land, the Arapaho, the Apache, the Cheyenne, the Ute. I pray to Creator that I may be adequate to share some good words, share some good thoughts, to be articulate. And I pray and give thanks to all those who are tuning in, and pray that we may all step into this conversation with open minds, open hearts, and ready to learn. All right, so I guess I'll kind of do a brief introduction as well. As Crystal mentioned, my name is Thalía Quiel. I'm an Afro-Indígena mujer, born and raised in Colorado. As a mixed race person, I consider myself a bridge between the Black and Brown community. My people are Ngabe Bugle of Panama and of Afro descent from Jamaica. So I walk both paths, I carry both lineages. And that being said, I feel like it's my role and my privilege, my honor to be able to bring my two communities together. But aside from that and a few other things, I take up a few other roles as well. So first and foremost, I'm a healer. I do energy work. I practice ancestral medicinas, ancestral ways of healing. I'm apprenticing under the Mexicayot tradition. I'm also a educator. I don't know how I feel about the word teacher, but an educator. I like to share knowledge, share perspective, hold space for people to learn. I also consider myself an earth worker, so I'm doing a lot of work out in Pachamama and nature, reconnecting, rebuilding relationships and sustainable relationships with our earth mother, and teaching the youth how to do the same as well as a defender of the people. So somebody who does a lot of activist work or tries to is active in my decolonial path and helping others to step into that path as well. And I'm also a student studying law. So above everything though, honestly, I consider myself a student. And I feel that I'm a student in all those other roles that I mentioned. I feel that I'm a student for life. I'm a student of life. And that just helps to keep us humble, right? When we recognize that we're all learning, we're all growing, we're all processing and healing, like we're able to realize that with that, there's a room for us to stay open to being checked, to stay open to asking questions and being curious, to being compassionate and recognizing, you know, like we're all learning, we're all growing, it takes time, we're gonna make mistakes, but giving ourselves permission to be vulnerable, to have these kinds of conversations, to learn, to be checked, all of that, that's what being a student is. And I consider myself a lifelong student, and I hope that we can all come to this conversation recognizing that this is an opportunity for us to be in that student role, to learn from each other. I'm learning from y'all just as much as you guys might be learning from me. And yeah, then we can be vulnerable, right? So that's kind of like a brief introduction of who I am. Why I'm here today, as you all know, is to kind of address this concept, this idea, this topic of anti-Blackness, which is something that is being talked about a lot these days, a word, a term, a phrase that's being thrown around left and right these days. And for me, language is very important. Words are very important. So if we're gonna dive into the conversation about anti-Blackness, how do we heal it, how do we address it, things of that nature, we need to know what it is and what it means to us. You're not gonna go to the doctor with some type of sickness and expect to be healed from that sickness if you don't first identify and define what that sickness is, right? So we can consider anti-Blackness kind of like a mental sickness right now. So what does anti-Blackness mean to you? What does it mean to society? What does it mean to Black folks? What does it mean to brown folks, right? Since we're talking about anti-Blackness in Latinidad. So that's something that I kind of want y'all to question and try to define for yourselves. But my definition of anti-Blackness as somebody who is Black and somebody who's also brown, anti-Blackness is pretty much anything that undervalues Blackness, Black culture, Black people as less than, and upholds white supremacist thought, colonial thought, racist thought. So this could be anything from behavior, this could be language, this could be norms, this could be policies, laws, regulations, attitudes, perspectives. Anti-Blackness can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. But what it really is pretty much saying that this is good and Blackness is down here. Blackness is less than good. Blackness is less than equal. If this is equal, this is what Blackness is. And that to me is what anti-Blackness means, right? So, and for everybody, it's gonna be a little bit different. That's just my personal view and perspective of what anti-Blackness means. So once we can define and identify what it is that we're talking about, what is anti-Blackness, that's step one. So then step two would be to dive into that and ask yourself, what is the source of anti-Blackness? If we're going with that metaphor of sickness, right? If anti-Blackness is a sickness, well, where do you get anti-Blackness? Like, what is it rooted in? How do we get that from, pretty much? And like many other sicknesses, right? You can catch a cold from somebody sneezing on you, from being outside with wet hair, from all sorts of things, right? So anti-Blackness can come from a lot of different places también. Pero when I sit here and think of anti-Blackness within Latinidad, I see two root sources, among a few others, but two of the main things is colonialism and colorism. So I'm kind of short on time, so I'm not here to give y'all a history lesson, which is very much a critical part to healing anti-Blackness and addressing it. But that's not what I'm here for today. But briefly, when we speak about colonialism, right, which is one of the root things of anti-Blackness, what we're talking about is when white European invaders went to Africa and came across the first Black people they've ever seen. And for some reason or the other, decided that because of your skin tone, you're less than, you're not worthy, you're dirty, you're uneducated, you're savage, you're not even human. And therefore, you're down here and we're up here because we're light skinned and you're dark skinned and all the other things, right? So when that happened, when colonialism first started, and when I say white people, when I say European people, we're talking about Europe as a whole. We're not just talking about British or England, things like that. We're also talking about Spaniards. Spaniards were also colonizers, which are the main colonizers of the Americas, of Anahuac, of Abayala, right? So I digress. That's where colonialism plays a role in how it's rooted in anti-Blackness. Is when it was established that white is better. And that's where colorism comes in, right? Because colorism is the idea of, it being a spectrum. If you're white or you're Black, and there's a spectrum. And the whiter you are, the smarter you are, the more worthy you are, the more beautiful you are, the more intelligent you are, the more, the better off you are. And then as you get darker along that spectrum to get to what is considered Blackness, then all of those things decrease in value. Your worth decreases in value, your intelligence decreases in value, your beauty, all of those things that I mentioned, right? So colorism and colonialism play two very big roles in the conversation of anti-Blackness. And for anybody who feels called to really dive into healing the anti-Blackness within themselves, within their lineage, within their family, within their communities, I personally believe that those are two really great starting points, is to learn your history about how Africa, how this continent, and frankly, how the world was colonized under a white lens, under white supremacy, under white superiority, and also how colorism takes a role in this, because it's a lot deeper than just anti-Black. It's more so, what I've come to learn, it's more so of anti-melanin. You don't have to be Black, but if you have dark skin, then that's not okay. So it's this phobia of being dark. It's this phobia of being melanated, of being, having more melanin in your skin, pretty much. If you see me looking down, it's because I took some notes, because your girl can talk for days, so I have to stay on track. So once we distinguish what it is that we're talking about, what is anti-Blackness? What is anti-Blackness rooted in? What is the source of anti-Blackness? Then you can start to address how to heal it, how to overcome it, how to confront it, how to address it, right? When you can actually understand what it is that we're even talking about. So when it comes to talking and addressing, confronting all those things, anti-Blackness, there's different levels to this conversation, especially when it comes to outdoors and within Latinidad, right? Because as I mentioned, Blackness is a topic within itself, but we're talking also about colorism as well. And that's why with regards to the outdoors, you see brown folks who are afraid to get too dark, to get too much sun, and to get too melanated, right? And then you wonder why Black folks don't want to spend time outside, right? Well, if it's already a bad thing for you to be too dark and you're already dark, and you know that spending time outside means spending time in the sun, means getting darker, then there's already a conflict there. There's already hesitation there. So that's one of the surface levels, right? Is what does it mean to get darker? And that's a huge problem in Latinidad. I've experienced lateral violence, which is something that I'll explain a little bit down the road with regards to just complexion. I will never forget when I went through this whole phase in my life where I didn't want to be in the sun. I didn't want to get darker, because every summer, after every summer when I'd go back to school, I would be made fun of for being too dark, for being black as night, for disappearing in the darkness, for all these things, right? And it created a lot of self-hate towards my complexion. And a lot of that stemmed from an experience that I had with a friend, a really good friend of mine who was Argentinian. And she was light-skinned. She had a light-skin privilege as a Latina, as an Argentinian woman. But she had family members who had mixed race babies who were Black and Argentinian. And we were all outside at the pool hanging out with her family, and it was time to get back in the water, get back out in the sun, and the little baby started going out and chasing the older kids, right? And they literally told this little baby, this mixed race baby, don't go out in the sun, si no te vas a poner negra como Thalía. And everybody started laughing and cracking up. And me, being the only Black person there, I felt humiliated. I felt ashamed. I felt hurt. And little comments like that, right? Because I'm sure if I were to sit with that group of people today and ask them, like, what was your intention with saying that? Like, why would you even make a comment like that? I'm sure they'd say something along the lines like, no, era broma, it was a joke. Like, don't take it personally. Like, I didn't mean it in that way. But that's the thing, right? These jokes, these surface level jokes about why Black people can't swim. Don't ask a Black person to go to the lake or do all that because Black people can't swim. Well, why do you say that? Is that the same thing that the European colonizers would say when they stole my ancestors and put them on boats to come over here during that transatlantic slave trade? And they would see my ancestors try to escape these ships and get into the ocean and die trying to save themselves. Is that the same thing that they said, Black people can't swim? Is that the same kind of jokes that they made, right? There's a lot rooted in jokes, a lot rooted in humor. And while a lot of times, like I said, it's innocent, right? A lot of people really don't know that what they're saying is going to be offensive. But we have to be mindful of those things. And that's what I mean by this surface level. Another thing that's kind of surface level too is, because we're talking about outdoors, right? So there's all sorts of outdoors activities and sports and things to do. But a lot of times people kind of put Black people in a stereotype of Black people, including Afro-Latinos. They play football, they play basketball, they run track. That's what they do. But when it comes to climbing, when it comes to hiking, when it comes to gardening, when it comes to swimming or just other outdoors activities, why don't we see Black folks there? And the first question you have to ask yourself, again, it's all about asking questions. And the first question you have to ask yourself is like, well, why? Is it a matter of accessibility? Is it more accessible and affordable and realistic for Black folks to engage in team sports like basketball and football, things that are accessible in their high school where they don't necessarily have to pay to do these things, right? As opposed to climbing and having to go to learn from a teacher, join a club, or get out into nature, like have accessibility just to get to a mountain to hike. You know, like does a Black family have a car to get out there? Do they have a ride? Are we being limited to, you know, just a lot of different things as far as accessibility goes. But then also just those flat out stereotypes of like Black people do these things. They play football, they play basketball, they run track, and that's it. Well, actually, Black people, Afro-Latinos, we're capable of doing anything, just like anybody else is. And honestly, we're pretty legendary when it comes to doing a lot of outdoors activities. pretty much think of any sport and there's a Black person, a person with Afro descent who's thriving in that. If we talk about baseball, I don't know that much about baseball, but one of the baseball players who I grew up idolizing was Mariano Rivera. He was Afro-Panameño. What about soccer with Pelé? He was Afro-Brasileño. What about Tiger Woods? That's an Afro descent person. What about Simone Biles in gymnastics, right? These are Black people who have made history in some of these sports. So we need to step away from these stereotypes that Black people can't swim. Black people don't do other activities other than X, Y, and Z. You know, Black people just don't know. There's reasons for everything. So again, I invite everybody to dive into what might be the causes why you don't see Black folks in certain activities. And then also recognizing that just like any other human being, we're capable of doing all sorts of things. And we do all sorts of things. There's also this concept of tokenism, right? I'm somebody who grew up in sports. My dad, who is where I get my Afro lineage from, he was super adamant about putting my sister and I into every sport possible. Soccer, golf, skiing, running. He put us in swim, he put us in gymnastics. Like the homie put us in all sorts of sports, and I'm super grateful for that. But with that, and especially in a state like Colorado, where you look around and most of the time, if you're not white, you're a minority here. You can find yourself oftentimes in a position where it's kind of like you're that token, like, oh, that's the Black girl on our team. Or in my case, that's the Afro-Latina in the team, or even just the Latina, because kind of digressing, I was raised to identify as Latina, and I'll get to that eventually. But I was raised to identify as Latina, right? So being a Black Latina, I was the token for both communities in one team, surrounded by and completely embodied by whiteness. This isn't just teams, this is about schools, this is about environments, friend groups, sports, like everything, especially, like I said, if you're in a state like Colorado where it's pretty much all white folks. And that can have its downfalls too, is just being like, oh, that's the Black girl on our team, that's the fast one on our team, that's the Spanish speaking one on our team. Like, we have it down, we got it covered. And it almost, when you frame it in that kind of a context, it makes it feel like that's all we need. Like, we have our Black person in our group, we have our Latino person, we have our Afro-Latino in the group, we're good. We don't need to add more to that. We've done our part as far as diversifying goes. And when it's put in, not only that, like aside from that, but then there's also this context of like, when you know that you're the only one in a group that carries that lineage, that comes from that background, it can feel super lonely. And again, a lot of times people say these things with the intention of being inclusive, right? Of saying like, oh, but we have a Black person on our team. Like, I have a Black friend, like I have a Black teammate. And even though your intention might be like, well, we're being inclusive, by saying that, you're drawing attention to the fact that there's only one Black person on the soccer team. There's only 2 or 3, like at max, right? And then it makes you wonder, like, what is your role on the team? Like, how do you fit in? How do you resonate with the other people who are a part of your community, a part of your team, a part of whatever it is, right? So tokenism, it's a lot of times people who aren't a part of that group that's being made a token of, like, can view it as something like, wow, that's great, you know, but when you're on the receiving end of that label, it can be very hurtful, and it can put a lot of pressure on you also. So keeping that on the top of your mind too. Let me look at my notes. I'm kind of moving a little fast. So on a deeper level, because to me, a lot of those things are surface level, the things that I just mentioned, right? They're things that come off without people knowing, that come off without people having that intention, that are very common. These are stereotypes, these are norms, these are things that are just out there and that need to be addressed right off the bat, but on a deeper level. And I invite y'all to just be as super open-minded and like open-hearted with a lot of the things that I'm going to say next, because these are real things. These are real topics. And I know for sure that me as an Afro-Indigena person, like I've experienced a lot of these things that have been perpetuated or imposed upon me by brown folks. And that's something that I'm gonna get to. But on a deeper level, we talk, I think first and foremost, about just the erasure of our culture as mixed race people, as people with not just brown descent, not just brown lineages, but also Afro lineages and Afro descent. So when we exclude the Afro part to Latino, right? Because Latino, it's kind of like an umbrella term, right? Like Latino can mean so many different things. It's comparable, I don't want to say it's the same, but it's comparable to this term of American, right? American can mean a lot of different things. It can mean a white American, a Black American, an Asian American, Mexican American. It can mean so many different things, right? And oftentimes when we address American, people will say African American, Asian American, Mexican American. When it comes to Latino, which I'll just add, the term American, this concept American, the term Latino, like those things can be problematic as well. But to get to my point, why do we exclude Afro when we're talking about Black Latinos? Why is it not worthy of mentioning that this person is a Black Latino? They are an Afro Latino. You're completely erasing and disregarding like a whole part of somebody's identity or a group identity when you don't even acknowledge it, when you can't even just like include that identity in a title, in a label. So that's for starters, right? I know for me, that was a part of my identity crisis was growing up. Like I mentioned earlier, I was raised by two Panameños. And my dad, Afro-Panameño, my mom, mestiza Panameña, right? But none of that mattered when I was being raised, when I was growing up. I was told that you are Latina. Never once was I, asked to acknowledge my Blackness or even told or taught to acknowledge my Blackness, to acknowledge my Afro roots. Like it wasn't until later down the road of my life that I started to really pay attention to those things. And so when you're raised in such a way that you're not even being taught that this is a part of your identity, then you kind of just exclude it from your identity. So from my experience, right, when you look at me, a lot of people tend to be confused. Like, well, where is she from? What is she? Like, what is her background? What is her racial identity? All of those things, right? So growing up and like still to this day, people will often ask me like, well, what are you mixed with? Or what is your nationality? Like, the questions that you get, right? And growing up, because I was only raised to identify as Latina, when people would ask me, what are you mixed with? I would say nothing. I'm Latina. When people would ask me, like, are you like, you're Black and what? I'd be like, I'm not Black. I'm Latina. This is literally things that would come out of my own mouth, right? And it's obviously, look at me. I'm Black. Let's be real. I'm Black. My hair is naturally really curly. Like I have dark skin. I'm Black. It's obvious, right? But when you're not taught that that's what you are, when you're taught that you're just one thing, just an umbrella term, it erases that part of your identity, right? So it took work for me to be able to identify with my Blackness, to be able to own my Blackness and to be confident in my Blackness, right? And then that also creates a lot of separation between the identity of one person. Because when we're talking about Afro-Latinos, you're recognizing that there are two parts and potentially more that might not be mentioned, but two parts of that person's identity that makes them one whole being. We are whole, complex, unique beings. And when you try to break it down into one umbrella, oftentimes a lot of who that person is and that identity can be lost. And then it creates this separation, right, of like, well, how Latina are you? Like, were you born in the homeland? Do you speak Spanish? Like, do you know how to dance? Like, do you know how to cook these certain things, right? And this is what I mean when I say lateral violence, which is something that I feel like should be always addressed. So lateral violence, for those of you who might not know what that term or concept is, it's pretty much when you see conflict between two members within the same community. So a brown person fighting a brown person, a black person fighting a black person, a Puerto Riqueño fighting a Puerto Riqueño. That's lateral violence. That's two people who belong to the same community conflicting, right? So when we say POC, when we say communities of color, we're not only recognizing, we're acknowledging, and we're putting Black and brown people along with a whole bunch of other people in one community. So when a Black person and a brown person are conflicting, that's lateral violence. So when a person who's mixed race, let's say, I'll use myself for example, me as an Afro-Latina, Afro-Indigena, when I go to a Latino setting, a brown setting, and I get kind of side eyes and people kind of look at me like, well, what is she doing here? Like, this is for brown people only. What are you doing here? Like, we're speaking Spanish here. Do you know how to speak Spanish? And kind of just, making assumptions based on my skin color, that's lateral violence. When when people uphold this, expectation that we have to prove ourselves, we have to prove our Latinidad, that's lateral violence. And it forces us into a position of almost like choosing, am I brown or am I Black? Like, what do I need to do to be more brown in this situation? Let me start whipping out my Spanish. Let me, let people know where I'm from. Let me wear my bandera glued on my head. Like, things like that. Because you feel pressured into proving how brown you are to people, to your own community, right? And that's really detrimental because it, like I said, it forces you to choose one side, and you shouldn't have to choose between everything that you are. You're not just this, you're not just that. You're a whole being, and you shouldn't ever, especially by your own people, you shouldn't ever be forced to choose and prove yourself. Because as Afro-Latinos, we experience that on the daily from white society, from white culture. We experience racism from the gringos who tell us, you're never gonna be gringo, you're never gonna be even close to that, like, don't even try, you're never gonna be good enough, because of this white supremacist colonial thought and mentality that I was talking about earlier, right? But then on top of that, to go to your own people and to be told, like, now you have to prove yourself to me. Like, how brown are you? How Black are you? Like, how much do you know about your people, your history, your culture? Like, when it's evident that that's what you are, you shouldn't have to prove that to anybody. So that creates a lot of separation between the two communities as a whole. Furthermore, remembering that Afro-Latinos exist all over North, Central, and South America, including the Caribbean. Oftentimes, here in Denver, let's just talk about that, right? Most of the Spanish-speaking community in Denver are Mexican. And when I come across a brown person who's Spanish-speaking, and I say something in Spanish, I address them in Spanish or whatever, there's always this, like, moment of being shook. Like, did that Black girl just say hola? Like, did that Black girl just ask me how I'm doing in my language? First of all, my brown family, I have to tell you, anybody can speak Spanish these days. Like, gringos speak Spanish better than some people whose ancestors spoke Spanish. You feel me? So we have to detach from this idea that only brown people speak Spanish. Because then it comes to a point where brown people start to get comfortable and start saying bad things around Black people who they think, oh, they're Black, they don't speak Spanish. And turns out they're Afro-Latino, like mixed race, and they understand what you're saying. I've been in so many situations in my life where I've been around brown folks who decide they want to say some bad things about me in Spanish. And it's like, joke's on you because te entendí y that's not chill, you know, like I know what you're saying. So detaching from that, but then also detaching from the idea that if you're Black and you speak Spanish, then that must mean that you're Puerto Rican. That must mean that you're from República Dominicana, from Cuba, from Colombia, you know, from the areas in Anahuaca and Abayala, which is the Americas, that have a larger population of Black people. Like I said, in Colorado, most of the Spanish-speaking people are Mexican. And when I speak Spanish to a Mexican person and they ask me, ¿de dónde eres? And I tell, or better yet, they assume, oh, eres de Puerto Rico? Like, eres Cubana? You know, I'm like, no, I'm Panameña, but what made you think that I couldn't be Afro-Mexicana? Because there are 2 million Afro-Latinos in Mexico. You know, Mexico has such a rich history with the Black community as far as helping us to free ourselves from slavery, teaching us certain things. Like, there's so much history there. And that's why I said earlier, like, I'm not here to give y'all a history lesson, but I'm here to encourage y'all to do your history, to learn your history, to relearn your history from a Black lens, from an Afro-Latino lens, right? So remembering that Afro-Latinos, we can come from wherever. We can be Afro-Latinos with all sorts of different backgrounds, not just Boricua, Cubano, Dominicana, things of that nature, right? So aside from those 2 things, there's also this concept of the N-word, which is something that I feel like is a first and foremost when we talk about healing anti-Blackness. We know, everybody and their mom knows, that the N-word is a racial slur that was created to dehumanize Black people, first and foremost, to make us feel less than, to uphold anti-Blackness. So if we're going to talk about healing anti-Blackness, we have to recognize that as brown people, we shouldn't be saying that word. Because a lot of times people will get so quick to jump on a white person, a white folk who uses that word, right? But what makes brown people think that it's okay to use that word? Even if it's in a song, even if you grew up with a bunch of Black folks, you grew up in a Black hood, that doesn't make it okay for you to use a word that was used to insult and dehumanize my ancestors and your ancestors, right? Because the N-word is a word that has been used on every race other than white folks, including brown folks. So it's not okay for anybody to say it. I personally don't even think that it's okay for Black people to use a word that dehumanizes us. Like, why would we want to use that word? But that's not what we're talking about today, right? We're talking about brown folks. So brown folks, I implore you to check yourself whenever you catch yourself using that word, or a song comes on and you know every single lyric, so you know that maybe this is a song, this is a word that you're not going to sing those lyrics to, right? And you're going to check your friends, check your family members who might be using that word, right? It's not a word that anybody should be using. And that's what I meant by language. Language is so important when we're using words that are hurtful and oppressive, when we're excluding words that are a part of our identity. Language plays a huge role in everything. It's how we communicate with one another. It's how we understand and relate to one another, right? So we got to be mindful of what language we're using. We also have to just remember that, like I said earlier, Black and brown culture, we have a history of working together. We have a history of coming together and unifying, right? So there's a lot of Afro culture embedded in Latino culture, not in so many different ways, from food, from art, from fashion and style, you know, the hoops, the baby hairs being slayed, the lip liner, like those are things that Black and brown people do. Music, right? To me, I feel like music is what really is at the root of not just brown culture, but Black culture too, right? So when we think about brown music, we think about reggaeton. That's Afro-Latino music. We think about cumbias. Cumbias, there would be no cumbias if it weren't for the African drum. So I feel like, man, as a brown person, you either like reggaeton or you like cumbias, or both, like me. And if you're gonna vibe with those kinds of music, you gotta honor and respect the fact that, like, that is also Black culture también. And that's what's so beautiful about it. It's that fusion, it's that unity that makes our culture so rich and so potent, right? So being able to recognize where Black culture surfaces and can be seen in brown culture, even in sports, because we're talking about outdoors, right? So even in sports, like, brown and Black people, what do we love? We love boxing, soccer, like baseball, like all of those things. Those are things that you see a lot of Black and brown people and Afro-Latinos like thriving in. So these are things that unify us. And oftentimes when we have these conversations about separation, that's all we focus on, is these are the things that separate us. These are the things that make us different. But we have to remember that Black and brown people, we are more similar than we are different. We have more similar histories, cultures, attitudes, perspectives, like lifestyles. All of that is more similar than it is different. So let's not forget to shine light on those things and to try to continue uplifting those things and putting those things at the forefront of these conversations también. So those are just some of the things, some of the areas where I feel like the conversation can be had about Blackness in brownness, Blackness in Latinidad, or anti-Blackness in Latinidad. And again, these are all things just based on my experience, right? Like I said, I'm a student, I'm still learning all of these things. And this is just based on my experience as somebody who lives this life. I can't say that I've got a PhD or a bachelor's degree studying Blackness and studying brown culture, but I live this life. I am a Black and brown person. And as such, I've experienced a lot of different things from both of these communities. And I really truly believe that, you know, as individual groups, like brown people individually, Black people individually, we're strong, we're powerful people, but together we are unstoppable. And that's why there's so many systems in place that tries to keep us separate from one another, to keep that lateral violence alive. Because if we're fighting each other, then the system, the mindset, their work is being done for them. They don't have to do anything, right? So when it comes to addressing anti-Blackness, all that you can do is be real, is be honest with yourself. Like, just be super honest with where you're at in your journey to healing anti-Blackness, to healing racism, to healing prejudice and biases, and be real when you see it within yourself. First and foremost, you can't heal your community, you can't heal your family, you can't heal nobody else if you haven't worked on yourself first and foremost. So do that individual work first, and then be able and willing and courageous enough to call it out within the larger community, call it out within your families, call it out within, you know, like I said, your larger communities, being able to ask the deep and difficult questions of what things are rooted in within yourself, within larger society, where they stem from, what is the source of these things, being able to learn the real histories, learn histories of Black people written by Black people, of Afro-Latinos written by Afro-Latinos, and talking to your Black relatives, talking to your Black friends, your Black comadres and compañeros, asking them, like, what is your experience? What do you need from me? How can I show up better for you? How can I support you? Like, what can I do to be better? Pretty much, right? And I guess above everything is challenging the systems and structures that that uphold and impose separation between the Black and brown community, and that oppress us as a larger community of people of color, as Afro-Latinos, as mixed race people, being able to challenge those structures and systems. But it all comes down to just being real, being vulnerable, like being willing to do the work. It's not gonna happen from one day to the next. It's not gonna happen just after me sharing my 2 cents, or, you know, after a week. It's work that will constantly have to be put in. But that's how we heal. That's how we get better. And viewing it as an opportunity to just grow, like just to be a better person and to create a better reality for all of us, right? So with that being said, that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say. I'm glad I was able to stay on point. So I'm open to questions. Like, I'm open to addressing anything that y'all might have questions about or thoughts on, and keeping this conversation alive. So yeah, that's the comment.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. We do have some questions. A couple of them have come through the chat. So the first one is, how does gender and race interact in the racist vision of Blackness within Latinidad? And how do you feel they work in your own identity?
Okay, so gender and, what was it? Gender and
race.
Gender. So we have to remember that when it comes to just identity, we all have intersectional identities, right? So I'm not just Afro, I'm also Indígena, I'm also a mujer, I'm also a straight mujer, I'm also, you know, a young person, I'm an able-bodied person, right? Like, we have all these things that contribute to what our identity is, and they all interrelate and intermingle. In my experience, I will never forget, and this is something that I shared recently on my social media, is like, when my parent, I'm first generation to so-called the United States of America. And when my parents migrated here, one of the things I'll never forget, that my dad pulled aside me and my sister and told us, like, you guys are mujeres of color. You guys are Latina mujeres. That's a double whammy when it comes to oppression. So y'all are gonna have to work 10 times harder in order to see the success from maybe somebody who might be your white male friend, right? So a lot of this, I guess, I don't know how to like fully answer this question because it's a loaded question. But pretty much it's just recognizing that we all have multiple identities, multiple different roles that contribute to our overall identity. So how do those different roles interact with one another? How can they support one another? How might they work against one another according to society, according to the norms and perspectives that are imposed upon us, right? And being able, I think the most important thing is being able to just know who you are. Doesn't matter how other people might try to identify you. Be able to own your identity however you identify, and walk in that proudly. Walk in that with, if people are gonna say, oh, she's not Black enough, she's not brown enough, well, I don't give a damn what you think. I'm sorry, but you're not living my life. You're not living with the consequences that I have to live with when I make decisions, when I go here and there. So it doesn't matter. This isn't about you. This is about me, right? So being able to own your identity authentically and confidently, I feel is the number one way to be able to kind of like disregard and sidestep when people come at you with ignorant comments, with ignorant perspectives, and things like that. But I guess for me, I feel like there's no greater privilege than to be an Afro-Indígena mujer. I feel like mujeres are super powerful. And when I say mujeres, I'm not just talking about you know, people who, like, I'm talking about anybody who identifies as a mujer, like trans relatives, like whoever identifies as a mujer, like it's a whole privilege to be a mujer. It's a whole honor to be a mujer because we come with a lot of medicine, and to come from not just two oppressed lineages, but also an oppressed gender. We've got a lot of work to do, right? Like, I have a lot to show up for my community. But as long as I can heal myself and identify in those ways, like strongly and courageously, and show others that, like, hey, like being mujer is awesome. Like being Afro-Indígena is awesome. Like there's so much medicine there. That's when we can start to see ourselves heal as a larger community. So I don't know if that answers that question, but that's what I had to say about that.
That was wonderful. Okay, the next question was, what do you see as the path forward for Afro-Latino or Afro-Latinx and Latinx folks as a whole, as all POC push for equity and against systemic racism in the US?
Unity. Between Black and brown folks, we have to get together in order to overcome all of the equity issues and systematically oppressive structures and systems that exist globally. Because I know because we're talking about like Colorado specifically and stuff like that, a lot of people might think that this is just a problem, an issue of los Estados Unidos, pero this is a global issue. Globally, POC, people of color, are oppressed, right? And we have to, as Black and brown folks, specifically as Afro-Latinx and Latinx folks, we gotta be able to recognize we're fighting the same fight. We are oppressed by the same systems. We are oppressed by the same mindsets. We are oppressed by the same groups. You know, like we fight the same battle. They might have, you know, certain nuances that make them unique as individuals, but overall, it's the same thing. So if we can recognize that, then hopefully we can put all the other conflict aside and be like, look, we can accomplish faster if we work together. We can accomplish more effectively if we work together. Especially because there are people who are both, right? Who are not just brown, who are not just Black, but who are both. I'm one of those folks, right? So being able to recognize that like our cause is the same cause, the same systems and people and governments that are putting brown folks in detention centers and locking children and family up are also doing that to Black people. The same police system and law enforcement systems that are shooting and killing Black people on the streets are also doing that to brown people, right? Like we're fighting the same fight. So in order for us to overcome, we have to get together. We have to unify. And we're not gonna unify if we don't get right within our own communities first, right? Like I was saying earlier, you can't heal somebody else if you haven't done your healing work, right? So as a community, how can we bridge the Black and brown community if the brown community is too busy fighting the brown community, if the Black community is too busy fighting the Black community, right? So there's layers to this work, but to answer that question as a whole, like Black and brown unity is a must, and it's powerful when we come together. One of the main people who I admire is Emiliano Zapata. He's known as an indigenous revolutionary in Mexico, but what's often excluded from his identity was that he was Afro-Indigena. He was Afro-Indigenous. Why is that excluded? Like that makes it even more powerful, right? So just remembering that we fight the same battle, we fight the same enemy, we fight the same systems of oppression. So let's work together to overcome those systems and overcome that oppression. Yeah.
The person who asked that question said, gracias for the response, right on point, unity. So thank you for answering that. Okay, we have about 10-ish minutes. So one question was, Thalía, what steps did you take to heal from things like this situation at the pool with your friends and familia?
Dang. Honestly, like it took a long time. I'll just start by saying that. It took a long time for me to even be able to come to terms with the fact that I'm a Black person. Because like I said, I wasn't raised thinking that, or I wasn't taught to acknowledge my Blackness, right? So it took a long time to even start there and recognize like I'm Black, boom, right there. But to heal from those kinds of experiences, I feel came with a lot of research and reclaiming was my medicine, honestly, to be able to, again, ask those really deep and uncomfortable questions of like, well, who am I? Like, how do I identify? All my life, I've been told that you are this, you are Latino, you are African-American, you are this, that, all of us have, right? But to be able to take back your power and say, nah, y'all aren't gonna tell me who I am. I'm gonna decide who I am. Like, I'm gonna decide how I identify, what labels resonate with me. and how I show up for this world, right? So that was step one, was to be able to ask myself that really hard question of who am I, how do I identify, and to be able to reclaim those identities for myself. That came with a lot of unlearning. First, before learning, it came with unlearning. Unlearning this idea that Black was bad, that I'm just Latina and not Black, that Black is ghetto, that Black is uneducated, that, you know, unlearning all of the things that we have been taught about Blackness, not just by the white culture and like white supremacist thought, which is at the root of it, but also by Latinos, like by my own family, right? Then after unlearning and being able to strip back some of those things, you have to relearn, but learn from your people. So if I'm gonna learn about Black history, I'm not gonna read a history on Black folks written by a white person or written by an Asian person. Like, I wanna read the history written by Black people. Same with Indigenous, right? Because I identify as Afro-Indígena. So learning from Indigenous sources, from elders, talking to your family is one of the main things that you can do. And that's not only going to heal you, but that gives your an opportunity to your family to heal, and for them to kind of challenge themselves with those same questions, those same perspectives, right? So there was a lot of things, honestly, that contributed to my healing. Being around people who see me for who I am and don't expect an explanation from me, don't expect to put a label on me and for me to abide to that label. I give a lot of credit to my Temachtiani, Atek Patin Young. He has been like pretty much at the root of a lot of my knowledge of who I am and how I identify. And he's an elder. So one thing that I always say to people is just talk to your elders, right? Like, and a lot of times people will say, well, I don't have any grandparents or grandparents alive anymore. And it's like, okay, well, I have one abuelita left that's alive. And what does that doesn't mean anything. I have tios, I have tias, I have community members that are in the brown community, in the Black community, who I can talk to, right? So talk to your elders, get perspective from the people who've been around, who have been around the block and who've been doing this for a long time. But you know, there's a lot of different things, and I'm willing to go into more depth about how to heal that, like separately on my own time. But because I know that there's a lot of questions, the last thing I'll say about that question is this: know that it's a process. It takes time. It took time to brainwash Black and brown people into the mindsets that we have now of anti-Blackness, of white supremacy, of anti-Blackness, anti-brownness. Like, it took a long time. It took centuries, 400 years and continuing to brainwash our people. So it's gonna take just amount of time to reprogram those ways of thinking, to challenge those ways of thinking, and to heal it. So be gentle with yourself. And that's what I mean about being a student, right? Like, be compassionate with yourself, be open, always stay open to like asking questions, to learning. Just recognize that it's a process.
Oh, I'm unmuted. So we have like 2 minutes left. Are you comfortable staying on longer for some more questions? We still have a couple of questions. Okay.
Yeah, of course. I'm however long is needed.
Perfect. So there was just a comment kind of speaking to what you're talking to now from one of the participants that said, and also, you know, the dismissal of negritude in Latino America, and how, for example, the Trujillo regime in Santo Domingo, people were encouraged to identify as white. So just exactly what you were saying, like, we were brainwashed, the history, the colonialism. And I am asking if Ricardo Tejeda, do you want to ask your question, unmute yourself and ask your question?
Wait.
Oh, there it is.
Oh my God. I feel like I know this person. Is this Rico? You're muted. You're still on mute.
No me escucha.
Sí, se escucha.
para todos nosotros.
Ricardo Tejada. No sé si es mi tío Rico. Pero no se escucha bien. Tienes que hablar un poquito más con volumen o acercarte más a tu computadora o teléfono.
I just want to say that we love you.
Oh, eres my tío Rico. Te quiero mucho.
I've been listening the whole program. I'm learning a lot with you.
Yay. Gracias. Thank you for being a part of this conversation and for your support. Te quiero mucho.
Love you too. Bye.
Bye. That just made me so happy.
Awesome. Awesome. So another question, Latinx is such a diverse space. So how can we all be better about speaking to our own experiences without generalizing too much while defending our experiences as a collective the way we are sometimes called to?
Yes, that's very true. I agree 1,000,000%. This is what I was saying earlier about Latino or Latinx being something that's kind of like an umbrella of an identity, right? But I think that the best way to go about that is to just ask. We are so scared. Like, what are we so scared about? To ask somebody, like, how do you identify? Like, how is it appropriate for me to identify with you? You know, like, do you prefer this term? Do you prefer that label? Do you prefer this, that? You know, like, just asking people what resonates with them and how they would like to be seen. Because like it was mentioned in the question, right? Like, everybody is different, right? Like, some people are cool with Afro-Latina, some people prefer just Latino, some people prefer Latinx, some people prefer Chicano, Chicana. Like, there's so many different identities. But if what you're trying to do, if your intention is to avoid offending somebody, if your intention is to avoid labeling somebody something that they don't resonate with, then just ask them. Like, just ask them, how do you resonate? Like, how would you like to be seen in this community, in this setting, in this group? And I think when we can just acknowledge that everybody identifies differently, and like respect that, that's when we start to see things heal. And then we don't have to like go into all this like extended titles of like Afro-Latinx, Asian Latinx, like including everybody, but just recognizing like this is the umbrella, and within this umbrella, there's a lot of people who identify different ways, but just ask them respectfully, and it can be inclusive that way, right? So I mean, it could be, there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but that's how I approach it. It's like, when I meet somebody, when I'm in a community, like, I let it be known how I identify, so people are clear, and I will ask. It's just asking and respecting how people respond to that question.
There's some great questions. And then this was just a comment, kind of, again, speaking to what you just said. It said about the term POC, and then how people are using the term BIPOC, which to refer to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to be more inclusive than just referring to Black and Brown people as minorities. Mm-hmm. So yeah, terms, how people identify, asking. Next question. When the N-word topic came up, I had a moment of pause because I thought you were talking about negrito, which leads me to reflect, is negrito a negative term? I always saw it as a translation of Black person. Is there anything associated with that word from the perspective of an Afro-Latino, Afro-Latinx that I should be aware of?
So that's so interesting, because this is something that I'm still working through as well. So I want to thank whoever asked that question. Thank you for bringing that up. So my family's from Panama, right? In Panama, there are a gang of Afro-Latinos, Afro-Panameños, right? And in Panama, sorry, my little timer's going off. To refer to somebody as negra or negro or negrita, negrito isn't offensive. And I was never raised to think that was offensive. Like, I remember my mom still to this day will say like negrita, like bonita, stuff like that, right? It's not bad. What I think is how you say the word, right? And I'll use my mom as a perfect example. So like I said, my parents are both Panameños, born and raised in Panama. Shout out to my family in Panama, Ometeo. So my dad is the one who carries the Afro roots. My mom is what people consider today as mestiza. And my mom, I don't think still to this day, she views my sister and I as Black, as negra, or as Afro-Latinas. So with that being said, she would always refer to us as negrita, as a term of endearment, as a term of like love, right? But then when I hear my mom, because right, we're all working through anti-Blackness, right? And when I hear my mom say things like, estos negros, the way that she says that, that's what makes it offensive. That's what makes it, like when you say it with a way of disgust, when you say negrita, whenever you add ita and ito, we know in Spanish, like that's kind of like a term of endearment. That's a term of like love and affection, cariño. But it's not to say that negra or negro is a bad word either. But how are you saying that word? How are you using that word, right? And even in relation to the N-word, right? We know that today, a lot of Black folks use that word with each other, to refer to themselves, with their own communities, right? But it's the way that it's being said, right? And not that I think that it's a word that should be said in general, but it's the way that's being said. When a Black person refers to another Black person as my N-word, as opposed to when a white person comes in and says that, you know, messed up words, that N-word, and the way that they say, it's all about the context. It's all about the intention of why are you choosing that word? Why are you saying that word? Like, how are you saying that word? Because dialogue and language is much, it's a lot about language, but it's much more than that. It's about tone. It's about your verbal language and the way that you're verbally communicating también. So I think personally, just to answer that question personally, I'm not offended when people call me negra or negro. Why? That's what we are, right? Why is that something I have to be offended about? Why is that something that I have to feel ashamed of, is to be called Black? Even in English, I come across so many people who will stumble on their words when they're about to call me Black, and they'll be like, oh, it's African American. To me, Black, I would prefer you call me Black than to call me African American, because when has the African diaspora in America been treated as Americans? When have you ever seen that? We're still fighting for that today. So African American, to me, isn't an accurate term. Black is, though. You know, like that's what we are. We're Black people. So taking the shame, taking the context and the connotations that are attached to terms like Black, like negro, negra, taking the negative connotations that are attached to those words away and being able to attach beautiful connotations to those words is what I think needs to be talked about more.
Awesome. The next question is from Sarah. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience. How do you handle microaggressions in your professional life?
And see, that's where I might be a little bit different from some of y'all here, because I choose not to even get involved in a professional environment that is gonna uphold and like impose microaggressions on me. And that's just, you know, there's a whole history, and that's just part of my character. Like, I don't know, but I'm glad that was brought up. This is something that I was talking to my homegirl about yesterday. It's like, you have to be able to find a way to gently have these kinds of conversations, because I think, especially now, there's this whole call out culture, right? Like calling people out, embarrassing them, humiliating them, canceling them from community because they made a mistake or because they could have done something better, instead of taking it as an opportunity to teach. And again, this comes back to what I believe is so important about being a student, right? Like when you can recognize that we are all learning and growing, you can see it as an opportunity to teach somebody, as an opportunity for you to grow as a career, like in your career, for your work environment to grow, for your manager to grow, for your coworkers to grow. Like it's an opportunity for all of y'all to grow, right? So when you can keep that in your mind and be like, okay, how can I use this opportunity as one for us to learn? Then you can be mindful about how you're going to bring it up, what words you're going to use when you bring it up, what tone, what attitude, when you're going to bring it up, who you're gonna bring it up to, right? Sometimes it might be easy to call out a coworker right then and there and be like, that's anti-Blackness, you know, what's wrong with you, and go off on them. But what might be more effective and what might be more of a learning experience for everybody is for you to go to your higher up and be like, I feel like we need to talk about anti-Blackness. I experienced something. I don't want to call anybody out. I don't want to put anybody under the bus, but my experience as a Black person in this work environment, like, I feel we need to address this. I feel that we need to talk about this, and this could be an opportunity for this business, for this company, for corporation, whatever it is, to be better, to be genuinely more inclusive and diverse. So I think my answer to that question is just asking yourself how you can turn situations into an opportunity for everybody involved to learn and to grow.
Thank you. This question is from Edward. Has Thalía connected with Mother Earth, including experiencing a vortex in places like Sedona, Arizona? And then what are her thoughts about shaman healers?
So Pachamama, if I had to say that I have like a religion, I would say my religion is Mother Earth. My priority in everything is Mother Earth, is everything that comes with Mother Earth, all of the elements, the plant relatives, the animal relatives, like our earth. And this isn't something that I would say that I learned from like a shaman perspective, as much as I've just learned from reclaiming my identity. Actually, reclaiming my indigeneity is that, like, indigenous thought is that earth is first. Earth is the priority. As far as, man, I've always wanted to go to Sedona, so this is like synchronicity that maybe I should be going over there. But with the question to shaman healers, shaman is another umbrella label. I have learned from many different healers and spiritual leaders from many different cultures. And all of those teachers have contributed to my path in reclaiming my identity, in understanding my identity, understanding my role, understanding my relationship to Earth Mother, to Pachamama. So Earth and healing are interrelated. They're two sides of the same coin. When you heal yourself, you heal the earth. When you heal the earth, you heal yourself. That's why we find so much therapy in spending time gardening and going for a run outside and breathing fresh air and drinking water. These are all things that heal us. So again, I give so much love and gratitude to my Temachtiani Atekpatin Young. I encourage all of y'all who are tapped into this dialogue to Google him and read some of his work. He's not just a curandero, he's not just a spiritual leader in the Mexicana community, but he is also an academic, he's a scholar, he has a lot of things that he's written and published. So I encourage y'all to search David Atekpatin Young and read some of his stuff. But he's a curandero. He practices the Mexicayo tradition, curanderismo, and I'm apprenticing with him right now. And all of that is related to the earth. All of that is related to identity and how we build relationships with ourselves and build relationships with our Earth Mother and everything else that exists, all the other people, all the other animals, all the other spirits. So I don't know if I answered that question, but.
Awesome. And then last question. You know, these conversations are not easy, they're difficult. So what is one thing or one way that you experience kind of healing and recentering and just that push forward to continue this work, to continue this path, and, you know, just to really, really acknowledge like your temple, your body is your temple, and that first and foremost is the thing you want to take care of.
Definitely. I'm super happy that question came up. Thank you for whoever asked that. I think it's all about balance. Everything in this universe is balance. Day and night, masculine, feminine, positive, negative. Everything is balance, is duality, and we have to recognize that within ourselves. So one thing for me on this specific path of like challenging racial structures and all of that identity, I've had to learn the balance of personal time, alone time, solitude, and community in social life. You have to have a balance there because it can't be done with just one or the other. One of the things that I've learned from my teachers is that it takes a village to heal. It takes a community to heal. It's not a journey that you can just do on your own. You probably can do it on your own, but community is medicina. Community is healing. There's so much growth and wisdom and just so much medicine, honestly, that comes from community. But there's also so much medicine and so much healing that comes from just being alone with yourself, from being able to sit with yourself and pray and reflect and write and create art and dance and cry, be vulnerable, scream, to be able to do all those things by yourself, but also to be able to do all of those same things with your community and finding the balance between those two things. And as a kind of example, I guess, with the rise of all of this talk in the community of, of Blackness and just all of the things that are like the Black community pretty much being at the forefront right now. There was a point where I felt like I had to be out there all the time, where I had to be out there on the streets all the time, where I had to be sharing my thoughts and perspective all the time, where I had to be checking in with my relatives all the time and stuff. I got to a point where I was giving so much of my own energy outwards that I felt like I wasn't even whole within myself, where I felt very separated between like myself, my spirit, my thoughts, where I feel like I should be. Like, it was toxic, it was very unhealthy, and it was very painful. So I realized, like, okay, I've been doing a lot of work outside. Now it's time for me to do some of this work within, for me to just withdraw, to take care of myself, to nurture myself, to rest, to process some of the things, the conversations that have been had in community, to process those and how they sit with me by myself, to reflect on some of those things, just to be alone and do that work alone. And then after doing that work alone, coming back to community and sharing with community what I've done by myself, what I've learned by myself, what I've realized by myself, and then flip-flopping, right? It's a cycle between external and internal. But remembering that, again, like I said, I think this is my third time saying it in just this dialogue, right? You can't heal nobody. You can't heal your community, your family, your lineage. You can't heal anybody if you're not well yourself. So you're not going to show up 100% to community and show up and be present and be, like productive within your community if you're not even present with yourself, if you haven't been resting, if you haven't been recovering, if you haven't been giving yourself the permission to process whatever it is that you're feeling and going through on your own as your own human being. So remembering, doing the work for yourself, that's where it all starts. It all starts there. I personally feel like by reclaiming my own identity, by dismantling some of these racial structures within myself, I've opened my eye, like the eyes of a lot of my family members. I've opened at least perspective for some of my family members to just think about some things, planted a seed, right? I know that I'm healing my ancestors by doing so. I know that I'm healing my lineage by doing so. And I know that I'm healing my future descendants. When I have kids, they're not gonna feel like they have to choose one side of their identity or the other. You're doing a lot of work by just healing yourself for a lot of people. So remembering that, honoring that, and respecting that. And then finding the balance there is how I would answer that question.
Thank you. That was the last question. Thalía, so much thankfulness coming from Colorado for you. This was very needed conversation, very important conversation within our own communities. I encourage you all to really have these conversations, sit with some of the questions Thalía has asked you about, and just think about, as Latinos, as Latinx folk, as, people of the global majority, we also have work to do, and we have to continue that work for the future. Wendy, Sarah, Deandra, everyone saying thank you. And yes, any last words, Thalía?
I guess I would just like to invite everybody who was a part of this conversation to drink some water. This is a lot of emotional work that we're talking about. A lot of emotions can be triggered from these kinds of conversations. So stay hydrated, drink some water, give yourself time to process everything that was shared. Remember that I'm just sharing from my experience, like I'm just sharing from my own perspective. So what I shared today isn't set in stone. It isn't what you have to think. Like I invite everybody to question me, to continue asking those questions, you know, and continue doing this work, and just be gentle with yourself as you continue diving into this. Be compassionate, be gentle. And other than that, I just, again, want to share so much gratitud, Tlazo Kamati, to Latino Outdoors, to you, Crystal, for being a connection between, like, bringing me to the table and I guess having me share my perspective and my story with your community. I'm so grateful. I'm grateful for everybody who took a part in all of this and creating all of this and helping this to come into fruition. Thank you to everybody who has, who's willing to have these conversations and do this work and challenge yourselves, like be proud of yourselves for this moment. And yeah, just thank you to my ancestors. I'm so grateful to be an Afro-Indígena. And yeah, Tlazo Kamati, I'm just so grateful and happy, and I'm just grateful. So thank you so much.
Awesome. So this webinar is recorded. Share it with anybody else who wasn't able to attend this session. And then also stay tuned for the rest of Latino Outdoors, Latino Conservation Week. That's going to be, this was kind of the kickoff. And then that will be happening the rest of all into next week. And yes, thank you all.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I love everybody. Tlazo Kamati. And yeah, I guess until next time. And also too, like I have these kinds of conversations a lot on my social media. So if you don't already, like I invite you to check that out and see some of the other content. It's not as nice and pretty. I will say that. It's not, it's my real personality coming through. So be prepared for all of that. Are you gonna put my handle? Are you gonna, okay, cool. She'll put my handle. And it's in a lot of the, like I'm tagged in a lot of the flyers and stuff. So yeah, I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. So how do I share this if I wanna share it? Like are you gonna like email me about that later or something?
Yeah, we can email you the link. Zoom, usually like after you record it, it saves into kind of a like a movie-ish link, and then we can go ahead and forward that to you, send it to you, and everything like that.
Perfect.
Yeah, and also shameless plug: if you learn anything from her, pay. If you can, you know, offerings. I think, you know, Thalía does incredible work, and she should be compensated. And right, with anyone who's doing this work, it's so important that you compensate, because this is free knowledge. I'm in higher ed currently, and people pay a lot of money to learn this stuff. And you know, our community, we need to support our own communities and really making sure that we're giving financial support when we learn from them. Because kind of what Thalía said in the beginning, like just because it's a published PhD person does not mean that they are the holders of knowledge. Our communities, our elders, our, you know, friends and familia, they are also holders of knowledge.
I agree. And I also just want to thank you for saying that. Thank you for that offering, Crystal. I appreciate it. And two, like for me, the best way that like one could repay me for this, because this isn't something that like, I don't know. For me, monetary is like a whole nother conversation, but I feel like the best way that I can, that y'all can reciprocate this kind of energy is just to take it back to your communities, to keep doing that work, like to have these same conversations, share some of these thoughts, these perspectives that resonate with you, with your relatives, with your communities, with your gente. And I would be really grateful for that kind of reciprocation. Also consider like reciprocating through sharing donations with Black organizations, Black grassroots and nonprofits. There's a lot of them, and it should be really, at this this point in the journey, like it's kind of everywhere. So just find it. But yeah, I'm just grateful. And if you do share any type of monetary offerings with me, it's incredibly appreciated, and I'm just grateful. So yeah, gratitude all around. All right. So
I think the monitors or the Latino Outdoors has to close it.
oh, okay, cool. All right, well, I guess I'll just go ahead and pop off right now then. So thank you everybody who joined. Worst threat. Thank you to all my family, my relatives who slid in to join this conversation. I love you all. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you, Latino Outdoors. I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their weekend. Black Power, Brown Pride, Ometeo. All right, peace, peace. Jag.